Coming up, as the Brooklyn Nets continue their West Coast trip, we ask the question, is Coach Vaughn still trying to manage the minutes and rotations? And is he perhaps making the wrong decisions along the way? We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team. It's the Brooklyn Nets. It's every single day. Over there's Doug Norrie. He's doing great. I'm Adam Armbrecht. I'm fine as well. Thanks for making us your first listen of the day. We're 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. And Doug, sure, some people say, start over the show. We don't have time for that. The discussion is too important. We got to get into Jacque Vaughn. We're going to take a look at minutes, net ratings, rotations, and I think ultimately the philosophical question that hangs over this organization, right? What track are we on? What agenda are we serving?
Yeah, it's been interesting these last few games for the Nets, and it's like, it's basically, we'll use the timeline since Cam Thomas came back, right? As like starting to get healthier, starting to see what this team is going to look like, right? He's been back since the 30th. Maybe you don't want to count that game against Charlotte because, he was not starting that one. They brought him in off the bench. So maybe if you start to look at these last 4 games specifically, where he enters the starting lineup, that's against the first game against Orlando, and they obviously have great results. And really, if you look since then, there is probably beginning to be some question around whether the Nets, I don't want to say have a plan, but like if they even know sort of like what path they want to take with their lineups right now. And sometimes it's a nice problem to have because you have a bunch of guys that, maybe can mix and match pretty well. And and there's some 5-man groups, 4-man groups where if you look at them, you say to yourself, oh, this really, really works. And then you have guys like Cam Thomas who are coming back and you have been dealing with some injuries and you're, trying to get rotations. But if you look at these last few games, the question has to be asked is like, they know what their plan is with like who they want to be starting every game necessarily or closing every game, which is sometimes the real proxy for like what you like the most about your team. It's one way to, you can start one way, but it's how you close that sometimes tells a story of sort of what you really want to do. And I'm not sure we've seen over these last few games if they know yet. Let's put it that way. If they're 100% clear about sort of like what they feel is their best foot forward when it comes to these groups.
Yeah, for me, I think that they're still trying to strike this balance. If I want to be confident in the organization, I'd say they have a plan, and the timeline for that plan is maybe a little bit difficult for fans or from the outsiders to digest. Not in terms of, I can't understand when you would make certain decisions or moves, but more so just that, okay, if that's the plan, I don't know if I agree with it, right? And we can talk about what some of these closing lineups look like, but you had mentioned Cam Thomas there, and even just from a minutes perspective at a high level here, it's interesting to think about that Mikal Bridges is far and away the minutes leader on this team, 34.9, almost 35 minutes. Nobody else cracks 32. A guy like Cam Thomas, pre-injury, coming back from the injury, it's basically lived in that 31-minute range, like never getting over 32 too often, had the 38-minute game against Orlando, but he's basically been balanced. Same thing when it comes to Cameron Johnson. Same thing when it comes to Nicholas Claxton. Like, there have been consistencies from the coaching staff, from Jacque Vaughn, that just says, like, these are the amount of minutes that these guys play. And I think the question we have to answer, if we so choose, is it the right minutes? And is it the right players? And are they the right rotations? And the biggest problem that I think they're running up against, to me, is if you make certain decisions that elevate younger players, not even Cam Thomas necessarily, then you're going to diminish maintaining the value of a Dorian Finney-Smith, of a Royce O'Neal, and even of a Spencer Dinwiddie maybe. And then when it comes to trade time, you're going to have a lot harder time setting a high price for guys that you're saying you've been playing closer to 20 minutes than 30 minutes over the first half of the season.
Yeah, and I think that, like, so, and I agree with you because they are trying to serve like two separate paths here, right? They're trying to say to themselves, you want to develop young players, you want to maintain, like you said, you want to maintain the value, and also just want to win games. And I
And
think
win
they're,
games.
I
Yes,
think,
and win games. Yeah, sorry, I didn't
but
throw that in.
ultimately
Winning
too is like
basketball.
what we want to get in the W column, and I think they're willing to go any direction. The way I like to sometimes look at this is to look at two things. One, what your first half rotations are, because those are usually sort of planned,
Yeah.
right? Like, you have a planned minute sub in on the first group of guys, and then how you close out that first half, and then how you close games. And then, so I look at those two things. And then the second part I use is like close games, right? So like the Kings game that gets away from you on Monday, like I'm not,
Garbage
looking at
minutes,
the,
doesn't matter.
yeah, you look at the end of that game and it's like it's Harry Giles and it's Watford, and you're like, okay, I'm not really sure. I'm happy to see them. I'm not sure I'm learning anything, right?
Right.
But if you look back at specifically the Atlanta game and the one before, I just blanked here. The Hawks game and the Orlando game, right? So if you look at those two and then you look at the first half of the Washington game, you say to yourself, okay, I think I can start to tell myself a story around like maybe what their plan is. And I think when you look at that plan, you actually have to start wondering how much they are trusting Cam Thomas here. Let's just start, and we can start with him maybe,
Sure.
right? It's like, it's because he comes back into the Orlando game, he plays 38 minutes. You're like, oh, this is going to look good. They're crushing Orlando. It's also kind of one of these games that got away late, and maybe they're not too worried about sort of how the game is going to close, right? So it doesn't actually fit into that proxy of sort of like what your plan might have been. If you look at these last couple games, though, even where he's starting, the tale that you start to get told here is like maybe he's not part of the group, because he closes the Orlando game, plays 38 minutes, but Bridges and Dinwiddie, Claxton, Cam Johnson, those guys weren't on the court. So you can't really look at the 38 minutes there and be like, oh, they played him big minutes. Like that was kind of garbage time minutes they played him in. When you look at the Atlanta game, he plays his first stint of 7 minutes, and then he plays the second half, comes out in the second quarter, comes out and plays another 5, and that's kind of the end. Is not part of the closing group. That same rotation carried into the Kings game, where they again kind of only played him like 12 to 14 minutes in the first half, and he was not tracking to be part of a group that was closing. And so like when you see those, just to start, does that start sending the signal to you that like, I mean, is he starting ceremoniously here? Right? Like, is he starting as sort of just because he's young and he's exciting, but like they don't really, when it really comes down to it, is this really who they want on the court? Because there's starting to be signals that that's not really the case.
And that's where, again, serving two paths, I think, is the right way to frame this. Now, not like, oh, wanting to win basketball games, staying with older veterans when you think this team should be going developmental. This is wanting, I think, in my opinion, they want to develop Cam Thomas. And you want to get him minutes with the most important players. Keeley, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, even Nicholas Claxton, guys that are going to be here, you think, beyond this season, for a certainty. So you want to play him with them, but you also know that this is a guy that is still learning some of the things. We talk about the Atlanta game. Okay, they bring you a different look. Jacque Vaughn said, hey, it's a learning opportunity, and he believes that he'll grow from that. But it's a good reminder, whether or not you agree that they played Cam Thomas as much as they should have in the last couple of seasons, they are now playing him 30-plus minutes. It doesn't necessarily mean that they believe in we want to win basketball games, we want to make the playoffs, that he represents the highest value. I'm not saying that I agree with it, but that would serve the narrative that we want to develop him, and we also want to safeguard of overexposing him. And coming up here in a second, we'll drill down on some numbers from a net rating perspective that maybe support that agenda from Jacque Vaughn and the Brooklyn Nets. We'll tap into that coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd. You know Josh Lloyd, to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. If you're getting into daily drafts, maybe you're just looking for the waiver wire, he's there to help. eBay's guaranteed fit. These are the fantasy picks of the week. Some really, really good ones. So you got Isaiah Hartenstein for the Knicks. Didn't start. Jericho Sims started the other night for Mitch Rob, who's going to be out for about 2 months, maybe plus. Hartenstein still got those aforementioned closing minutes like we just talked about. So Jericho Sims maybe starting there just as a name. And then Hartenstein, he's going to be the guy closing in some of those closer games. Some other good ones. Dante Exum's getting a ton of run with old friend Kyrie Irving out of the mix. They've even started him along with Kyrie. So those minutes are there for Dante Exum. Actually been able to live fantasy-wise playing alongside Luka Doncic. And then one of my favorites, had so much stuff on him early on in the season, Ausar Thompson. He's back in the starting lineup. Maybe people let him go and they moved him to the bench during this epically bad Pistons run. It's not Ausar's fault. He's been really, really good from a fantasy perspective. Just some of the guys you're going to keep an eye on when it comes to fantasy. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack bumpers, whatever your baby needs. eBay Motors has it with eBay Guaranteed Fit. It's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus the prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items apply. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
All right, so as we continue the conversation around the minutes, the management, the rotations, on Cam Thomas, I want to make it clear, and Doug and I said this last year after the trade, and we said it at the start of this season as well, Cam Thomas needs to play. He's a young player. He needs to develop. He's one of your best offensive weapons. He needs to be a guy that just gets through some of the growing pains, has some bad shooting nights, starts to give out a few more assists, and shows you that he can continue to develop into that type of player. Now, that being the case, I do want to just peek over at the net ratings of this all, because if you're going to sit here and talk about, and this is something fans will definitely hate to hear, and we've said it before, where do these guys stand on offense and defense? Well, Spencer Dinwiddie's your best rated offensive player, 120.5 offensive rating right now in the season. Cam Thomas, inside of your starting lineup, he's 115.6. Only guy that he's better than is Nicholas Claxton. Now, he's right there with Mikal Bridges, by the way. Cam Johnson actually 118.4. Flip it over defensively inside the starting unit. Cam Thomas is a 116.4. That's the 8th worst defensive rating out of the key players. When I talk about bench, I'm talking about Lonnie Walker, Day'Ron Sharpe, Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Dennis Smith Jr. We go 10 deep on this thing. We're not going to go into some of the other fringe players, though we may talk about them. That combination there, being tied for the 5th best overall out of that 10-man group offensive rating, and 8th or arguably, 3rd worst defensive rating, he's a net negative. He's a net negative. He's 8th in minus 0.8. It doesn't exclude the fact of how good he is offensively and the fact that I think he needs to play. But also, if we're just piling it all together and saying, how do we win basketball games? Cam Thomas is still closer to being a guy that is more individual results oriented than he is team results oriented. I don't mean from a personality or mentality, just from results of what his play is going to give you, right? If he ISOs and he gets his buckets, it's great. We're starting to see him incorporate other players as well. It looks really good. He's just not there yet. And I think that it's okay to say he's there playing over 31 minutes a night right now. And Jacque Vaughn is still trying to hedge when it comes to late game sequences. I need the better defensive players out there. I need guys that I can maybe just trust a little bit more right now while a young player is still learning.
And I think we've seen this with Vaughn, and this has always been a little bit of a concern, is that I think there are trust issues when it comes to the younger players. It took him it took him definitely too long to get Cam Thomas even worked in originally, right? We should have been seeing so much more of him last year than we saw. And when the season was like, how far are we going here? To make the playoffs, we got to have some of these young guys play. You have to know. Right. So we've already have evidence that they've been he's been unwilling to maybe risk it or to live with some of the lumps if it's not going well, because it's not going to go well all the time for these guys. Right. And so there is a little bit of a concern. When we joked about which lineups we would see, who we'd see more of, we always kind of just defaulted to hey, we're probably just going to see a lot of Royce O'Neal and Dorian Finney-Smith because they're veterans. And it's clear that he likes playing those guys more than he likes Cam. And not to make this a whole episode about Cam Thomas, because that kind of wasn't the point, but it does point to sort of what the major concerns are here around when you start to see how some of this stuff is shaking out. Because the default mode is probably just always going to be Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce, as long as these guys are on the team, right? You put it really good before when you say it's a trust thing. Does he trust these other guys? There's not really a lot of evidence unless Cam's going completely off, right? Where it's you can't, and even then he's kind of taken him out of times, yeah. Right?
And by the way, because let's get it away from Cam Thomas and drill down on what you're talking about, Jacque Vaughn, and whether or not he trusts these players. Okay, overall net ratings for that 10 group of that player that we talk about. Day'Ron Sharpe's a 12.8. This guy is your best overall net rating on the team. He's a 104.1 defensive, and that maybe you expect because of what his mentality has been. But if you tap into the offensive side of this, Day'Ron Sharpe's a 116.8. Now, he's coming on a little bit more lately. So maybe we take this and we say, now over the next 10 games, you want to see him playing more. You want to see him carving out a larger role. But you can make the case early in this season. We've been very surprised in a great way about his overall play. Spencer Dinwiddie's number 2. Cam Johnson is number 3. So nothing to write home about. Dennis Smith Jr. is actually your 4th best net rating. Now, the offensive number is 110.2, so you know what he's there to do for you. But when you get down to the reason why I say, who else can we talk about? Well, Dorian Finney-Smith is a minus 4.8. He's the worst of the group. Now, again, the three-point shooting, that's really mattered. He has length. Maybe the eye test tricks us at times, but this is the problem. And Royce O'Neal is only narrowly above Cam Thomas at a plus 0.3 net rating overall. These are 2 players that are over 30 years old that occupy significant minutes on this roster. And even though it's not 1-to-1 in terms of who they're in the way of, the bottom line is, as Doug always says, you only got 240 of these minutes every single night. So when you start breaking them down and you start looking at these guys, it's impossible to not say there has to at least be a 3 to 4 minute stretch here that Jacque Vaughn is willing to sacrifice to veterans as opposed to younger players, Cam Thomas or otherwise, and live with the results, as opposed to feeling like I'm banking on what I have in the rear view on these players rather than what I don't know could be with someone else.
Yeah, and look, the sample size is still pretty small here. Like they're just getting back to a point where they're mostly healthy outside of Simmons, and they're still missing DSJ and Lonnie Walker. So like we still haven't gotten probably the full plan, but I think we have enough of a sample to say if you're hoping that development's going to happen around some of the younger guys, don't hold your breath here. Right. Now the Sharp thing's interesting because that actually does fly in the face of it, because it's like, well, they've trusted him with a lot of high leverage minutes. Right now, some of that's because Claxton's gotten in foul trouble and there's been some other things there, but Day'Ron's also just earned the minutes. Like he's been really, really good on a pretty consistent basis. They don't have a lot of other guys like him. Like after, unless you want to say Giles is like him, and I'm not sure where that he really lands, but it's like they clearly have trusted more minutes out of him. It could be just more need than anything else. So maybe that's like the exception that proves the rule. Like I'm not really sure with him, and maybe it just is a Cam thing. I don't know, but as we move forward, maybe we can make predictions about sort of like what we're going to see here in the future. But I think like that is. If there was a point where we're going to start feeling really frustrated about something, I could see like a month from now, this being a frustration when we look back and say, hey, let's look at these last month of minutes. Like what's happening here? Like what's the goal, right? What we're getting with the veterans. At some point you might have to commit to the future. I'm not sure they're going to be there for it.
And specifically on Day'Ron Sharpe, if you want to make the case that they're going in the direction of a player that's showing it, earning it, and deserving it, he only played 8.7 to start the season in October. He played 16.6 minutes per game through November. And early here, 4 games into December, he's played 19 minutes and came out of this last one after just 14, obviously in the blowout loss to the Sacramento Kings. So that is going in the right direction. The footnote on that, before we turn our attention to a couple other players, and you said predictions, and I also have maybe a question or two about guys that aren't going to be on this list because the sample size isn't quite big enough necessarily. But the Nets don't have a Day'Ron Sharpe that also shoots from the outside, or a Nicholas Claxton that also has a mid-range game. That's a part of why some of these veterans are still here, because the Nets don't have totally complete players that can eat up 25, 30 minutes necessarily. In a second, we'll dive into the bold questions and predictions around where we think these lineups and rotations go in the games ahead.
All right, before we get to that, talk about our friends over at Game Time. Look, you're buying tickets for the sporting event, the concert, the play, whatever the big event in your area is, comedy show too. You got to go to Game Time. Game Time is going to figure this out for you so you're not getting frustrated and you're just getting what you want. Game Time is the easiest way to buy tickets for wherever you're going to. They have last-minute deals. They have all-in prices. They have views from the seats, so you're not going to get surprised when you actually sit down to take a look at the stage. The best price guarantee as well. It just takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. If you head on over to Game Time right now, New York area, Madonna, $40. Come on, stop it. Rams at Giants, $35. Just some of what you're going to get. They got a bunch of Nets tickets up there as well, ranging in prices, because some of the games, the Knicks coming into Barclays, that one's going to cost you a little bit more. Maybe you want to just save a few bucks, go to that the Pistons game on 12/23. I don't know, maybe Pistons are headed for a record right there. Not in the good kind. That's all the kind of stuff you're going to get over on Game Time. Really, really easy to get started on Game Time right now. You download the Game Time app, you create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA in the Game Time app for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed.
All right, so as we tie a bow on this, I don't know, somewhat philosophical discussion around where the Brooklyn Nets are going, you said predictions, right? What comes next here? You can also take a look at a guy like Dorian Finney-Smith, who we know because of the injury to Cameron Johnson. He played a little bit more early in the season. So far, now again, this last blowout game, because there's so few games here in December, is going to be a little bit deceiving. But he's coming down into the upper 20s, 27 minutes, as opposed to 31, 32 going back through November as well. So maybe we will see the incremental progression towards some of these other players. Let's ask that question. I tend to think that Jacque Vaughn is too cautious, as we said, about going to some of the younger players, and that he's trying to serve the agenda of making the playoffs, and because that's an organizational goal. And also, my belief is they know. And I think, as we said at the top, they're trying to serve the agenda of keeping the value high on these veterans because guys are going out the door. This is not going to be the roster after the trade deadline. Now, I've battled myself and talked about it on this podcast about if you get rid of these guys, what does it mean in the end? You're going to hurt your chances to make the playoffs. Maybe. But at some point, especially when you look at net ratings and hopefully when combinations start to work themselves out with Cam Thomas in the starting lineup, I think you'll bear the fruit that these veterans are right on the top edge and about to tip over the wrong side of this. And you don't want to be holding on to these players a year from now. So I think it's going to go in the right direction. I just think it's going to be a frustrating probably next month.
Yeah, I feel like that is like the rose-colored glasses version of this, where it's like they're trying to keep because I just think we just kind of know what it is. I think that he doesn't want to play the young guys, and actually, I really wonder down the line what happens with guys like Derek, what happens to guys like Clowney, like where not even Jalen Wilson, whatever.
Jalen Wilson, I actually find a little bit more intriguing just because he's healthy and he's come up for spot starts.
Okay, so throw him in there. Throw him in the group because I think at some point, like the hope was we were going to start to see some of these guys get real minutes. Maybe it's after the trade deadline because some of these guys move out the door, like you said. But I don't know. Like I think that do we have here? We're a year into this now with Vaughn. And I know that the motivations have been different at different times. It's not always his fault. Like he had the KD Kyrie Simmons thing and they're playing for something totally different. Sure. And then the team totally shifts and he probably is playing for his job or coaching for his job, but then he gets an extension. So you feel like there's some safety there. Like you should be able to live with some downside. But then we go through the second half of last season where it's just kind of like they play 7 guys and that's kind of it. Right. And now this season we're seeing sort of some of the same trends happen. And the results have been good, and they've been winning. And I don't really want to complain with that part of it. And I think he's actually done a pretty good coaching job, all things considered. But if we're just viewing it from this other version of it, do we have enough of a sample to say to ourselves, like, we know what's going to happen here? And if we know, are we happy with it? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, and so here's the two things about it. The one other guy I was going to throw into this group, and this is like the damning one, it's Trendon Watford. Because I think his sample size has always been pretty good. It's been a little bit, it has some of that Dayron, a little frenetic energy at times. But by and large, the sample size has been good for him. Now, it doesn't mean that I think he needs to be cracking into this rotation, but I think there should be a case made that if he can earn more minutes, he should get more minutes. And I don't know. I don't know if that's being allowed or not by the coaching staff at this point. Now, the other thing is here, you mentioned about the agenda. Here's a reality check. Dennis Smith Jr. in his mid-20s. He's been injured a lot this season. Lonnie Walker, up and down with injuries. You know who hasn't been injured? Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, like Spencer Dinwiddie. These older guys are the guys that are going out there and logging the minutes. So there is something that even Cam Thomas, though we feel like it's pretty fluky for him, he went down and missed a chunk of games. So the thing that might be informing Jacque Vaughn is like, I need reliability. Well, every old guy has been there, and every young guy, even Nick Claxton, has missed time, right? So this isn't maybe it's in defense of Jacque Vaughn. He's like, maybe I would play the young guys, but if I can't have them healthy and available and learning it and earning the minutes, I think maybe what could happen is every time these guys come back, it's like, okay, reset the clock a little bit on how you get into the pecking order again. Dennis Smith Jr. seems ripe to get in there because the defensive value is there, right? Lonnie Walker seems like he's earned his role, but it's probably a lot harder for Jacque Vaughn to say, and now Trendon Watford gets a share, or I'll use Jalen Wilson just because he's been up. Now it's Jalen Wilson gets some run here. Well, can I really depend on that if I think I'm only one beat away from these guys going down again? Let me lean on the players that I had for 27 games last year after the trade deadline that, as you highlighted episodes ago, has a very positive net group rating. They go out there, the offensive, defensive, it all makes sense on paper, right? So maybe Jacque Vaughn is just kind of being really logical about it. And this season and this team and this organization needs to be a little bit more abstract in the way they approach things.
Yeah, and I mean, and I guess we're gonna find it out. The good news is more than anything else is like we are just going to know. The question is going to be whether or not we're just frustrated by what actually happens, right? Like we'll know the story here. Now they have.
So are you going to be frustrated? Are you going to be frustrated by what happens?
Well, if it's just like if it's just all veterans all the time and we never see anything, of course.
If it kind of stays, let's just say it stays the way it has been, right? Essentially.
Well, okay. So at the one hand, if they're winning games, it's gonna be hard to complain. I'll put it that way. If they're gonna take a bunch of W's and it's gonna be a above 500 team, I'm not really sure how you can play. I do think you can do both things. I think you can play some younger players here and there and be sort of committed to that, understanding that there might be some downside, but we're gonna have to see at some point. I think there's going to be like some key moments that will happen. Like the trade deadline will tell us a lot. Like we'll know a lot. Like the team could look just a lot different. So I think there's going to be some key moments that will force their hands. I do think that the short term is going to look mostly the same here is my guess. I think, and I want everyone out there to just keep an eye on these Cam Thomas rotations. Like keep an eye about when he comes out and when he comes out in that first half and doesn't come back in, or who's closing these games when it's close. I mean, this will tell us a lot. You're going to be able to see it out there too. Like we'll all be able to watch it together in real time. I do think it's interesting, and my final thought here is in the offseason, they hired clearly an all developmental staff, right? Like led by Kevin Ollie. Like these guys all came from Burrell. All these guys are part of the development program, whether it was with Unite or it was with Long Island. Like these guys all came from a place where it was like, hey, we're going to develop guys. So it would point to the idea they're going to get on track with some of these young guys at some point because of who they have on the staff. And maybe it's just like a later season plan. I just don't trust. Sometimes I don't trust the vision, and that one I'd have to see it to believe it. And I think I have to see a lot of it, and I'm just not sure it's going to be there.
I think I have to see a lot of things to believe a lot of things, right? Yeah, I tend to agree with you. The one thing on the coaching staff, I would say they can be developing them. They're just not developing them in the game, right? This is practice. This is film study. And by the way, the only way that you truly implement it is to get them on the court. So we understand that at some point the rubber has to meet the road on that, but that can still be a value in having these guys and even having players in the background that maybe you don't think are going to be important until later this season or even into next season. The only thing here that you mentioned as well is if you're winning games, it's really difficult to say you need to go another way. We say this to fans all the time, right? We want to see Harry Giles. Harry Giles. I want to say Harry Styles. I got myself crossed up. But Day'Ron Sharpe plays well. Nicholas Claxton plays well. They win the basketball game. Stop asking for things when it's going well. The weird part for me is my last thought would be when you look at the schedule and we talked about this being difficult, I think a real value here and Jacque Vaughn's not going to do this, is to at times understand that when you're coming up against a team that might be more likely a loss than a win, go ahead and give the young guys a little bit of a sample here because it's not, this isn't going to be a grind out one, and you can grind your veterans down to a pulp and lose by 15 to 20 late in the fourth quarter. Why not give some of these younger players 15-minute runs in these games? Say it's about getting some rest, it's a long road trip, whatever you want to disguise it as. You can manufacture means to get in some of these young players, and maybe you get pleasantly surprised by one of them, because even as they're constituted right now, they still need somebody else on this roster that is going to become something more than expectations, right? That's how you're going to move the needle and take this from being a really fun start of the season and making something that's sustained through and to the playoffs.
Last fall for me, it's an unenviable situation that they're in here, right? Like it's we've said it we try to stay consistent here. The Nets are basically running two different timelines that most teams would have chosen one direction or the other, right? But the Nets just aren't afforded that thing. So it's not, to some degree, their hand is forced here in a way They did it themselves. Like Marks did it themselves. It's not like no one came in and took their draft picks from them and said, got them and moved on. So it's like they did it to themselves, but where they just is where they are now. So this is just something we want everyone out there to keep an eye on. Let us know what you think. Like, are we crazy here? I mean, is this looking too far into it, or is it like a complaint that you think you either have just said out loud, or maybe have been starting to think about sort of how they're coming along with some of these players?
And last thought for my last thought. I like that we're doing this. Multiple last thoughts. If you could get in the comments on YouTube, but be more than just we want Cam Thomas, because we agree, we all know that, right? Like, what is the thoughtful take around what you think should be happening, how they should be developing these players? Because I'll tell you, when we do our post-game episodes, the comments and the conversations we get into, they're great. So let's go ahead and keep this one going here, because I think it's a fun one, probably over the next month of the season for the Nets.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Make sure you subscribe. Subscribe over on YouTube. Listen, I'm getting all flustered. Too much talk about Cam Thomas and company. Subscribe over on YouTube. Subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast, Locked On Nets.
Nothing is more difficult and therefore more precious than to be able to decide. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Oh man, R.I.P. I guess not really. We will be back again tomorrow. We'll be back again. Stay gone, friend. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. Stay dead, Napoleon. Basketball. Yeah.